Have you ever thought about how unsafe our roads are for pedestrians and cyclists? Have you heard that there is no space for footpaths and cycle tracks on our roads because we need it for the motor vehicles? You will hear this in the news and comments on social media and the people you talk to. They are based on real experiences people have in our cities. But here is the catch. The consequent decisions you make after hearing these comments on these specific problems usually end up perpetuating the very harm you're trying to prevent. These decisions come out of what we call heuristics or biases or fallacies that come in our minds. And they are usually a result of different things that we hear and the events that we react to. Hi, I am Sathya Sankaran. You are tuned into the OoruLabs podcast. These are terms I will explain to you in today's episode of the Explainer series of the podcast. Let's jump in. In episode 1 of the Explainer series, we talked about updating our Bayesian priors, or in plain English, looking for patterns from general prevalence rather than making a conclusion from specific instances. This quick conclusion comes out of what is called fast thinking, which I spoke about in the episode 2 of this season. So if you haven't watched all these, you should. You can find them in the video section of the podcast or the Explainer playlist in the playlist section. Let us focus on 4 biases that are useful for us. There are many others that you can go into, but let's just take these 2 so I can explain them with examples of the city. Bias number 1. This is called the availability heuristic. This is where you overestimate the probability of something you hear often and or find it easy to remember. You overestimate that. We talked about the accident example in episode 1. If you look at a news report of crashes and the percentages and the kind of accidents that are happening, and I asked you how many people who walk on the roads or cycle on the roads die as a percentage of the total, you would probably overestimate and say 20%. But if you compare the number of pedestrians who died of vehicle crashes in 2024, it is around 0.00001% of the total number of residents of the city, all of who probably walk outside. But the news reports will make you believe it is higher because of the way it is framed. This will also make you think twice about walking and cycling on our roads, right? And once you start moving everywhere in your car, you're making it more unsafe and increase the percentages of bad and fatal incidents for the pedestrian and cyclist. So it kind of becomes a self-serving prophecy. And the adverse reaction to this event data, which is available to you, is called availability bias or availability heuristics. You will apply the example data of specific incident to make a conclusion of what the percentage of general prevalence is before going in and trying to understand the whole thing. So instead of walking and cycling more and asking for 0 incidents and probably making it safer because more and more people are walking and cycling, you will end up moving into a motor vehicle where, like you heard in episode 1, you have a higher chance of dying actually because of something called the Peltzman effect. I'll tell you more about that in some other episode. Here is bias number 2. It's called anchoring bias. It describes people's tendency to rely too heavily or anchor yourself and your opinions on the first piece of information you receive on the topic. And this first piece of information influences the decisions you make subsequently. Let's say you're going to shop for a bicycle and it costs around 30K, right? And the label says 30,000 rupees. You would think it is expensive. You'll shop around for something more cheaper. But if it instead was listed as a discount over a cost of 65,000, you're more likely to think it's a bargain. You have been primed with a thought of the 65K. This is an unconscious bias that is natural, but only when you don't have enough information. If you knew what the bicycle was, it was a geared bicycle, it was a hybrid, it was just a normal tired one, but it has 7 gears or 8 gears or whatever it is, then you know the cost and you had that information, you Googled, you looked it up and you've done some of these things. The point is, like I said in the other episode, you will not do that unless you get into a slow thinking mode. So if you're doing impulse purchases and impulse buy, you will only make decisions on how you are anchoring your information. It is expensive in time and effort to gather information, turn them into knowledge, and repeatedly using this knowledge to become wiser. The internet has changed it's changed the game. You can search for data, you can Google, you can chat GPT, you can listen to multiple viewpoints on YouTube or Spotify. When I say things, you can cross check with other things, update your priors, update your information, go back and broaden the knowledge, right? These are things that I think you need to do in order for you to turn information to knowledge and knowledge to wisdom over time, right? And the awareness that fact that you may want to switch to slow thinking where possible and use data to back up your conclusion. Now, this is a very useful tool to have when you're making opinions and when you're being flooded with a lot of information. Anyway, that is anchoring bias. Here's bias number 3. It's called the framing effect. Okay, it's a cognitive bias in which people decide between options based on whether the options are presented with a positive or negative connotation. How the message is framed is very important. Let's say I tell you you have a 10% chance of dying if you're cycling on our roads today. Versus if I said you have a 90% chance of being alive and healthy and survive longer if you were cycling on our roads today. It's the same thing presented differently. The first one makes you anxious, whereas the second one makes you feel better. So this effect is essentially used extensively in communications. In how you present the message is very important. The availability bias in the news every day about the doom and gloom may make you feel that the world is going to the dogs. It may well be. But if you use the framing effect to communicate all the non-newsworthy things that are going on right now, you may even participate in the progressive efforts that make us all better in the long run. Right? If you only heard the doom and gloom and conclude that's a bigger percentage and sit at home and think you're going to continue to do what you're doing because it's anyway going to the dogs, that's one way of looking at it. It is a self-fulfilling prophecy of making it worse. Or if you hear the other side, which is you understand what are the things that are going right and how do you build on that, you may even participate in that, right? It is useful to understand that we still have to fix the negative actions going on in the cities that cause harm, but framing probably gives you confidence to tackle them from a position of confidence rather than a position of despair. And the tools you will use and the things that you will apply might be totally different. And this is why this is an important thing, bias that we should pay attention to. Bias number 4, loss aversion. This is one of my favorites because I fight it every day. Loss aversion is a cognitive bias where the emotional impact of a loss is felt more intensely than the joy of an equivalent gain. Let me give you an example. We know we can save pollution and congestion in the city if we ditch the car or motor vehicle for some of our commutes and switch to walk, cycle, or public transport. I have even found by the data that I see on the platform Altmo, which I've built and I use to collect the data to understand these patterns, and from various other studies that are done in the city, that switching our commutes is going to be better off. And in order to do that, we will need to be able to provision safe bicycle lanes and better footpaths. But the few who are still stuck in their motor vehicles think that there isn't enough space for these street furniture like bicycle lanes, footpaths. They think it's a luxury because I need it. Now, here's what the thing is. Even if you provision an extra lane for these motor vehicles, it will not give you that much joy. But the amount of pushback there is for allocating the space better, taking away 1.5 meters of a cycle lane. Your car tire also won't fit on it, but there's so much opposition to giving it away. In spite of knowing from the data that I have that will streamline the traffic, more people might use that. Whoever is left on the motor vehicle will be able to drive smoother with less interruptions and chaos on the roads. Very intuitive, but the loss of that 1.5 meters hurts more than the gain of multiple lanes and road infrastructure that is continually being built. I mean, you can take another example. There is evidence to show that you may be happy when you get more money, but it hurts more when you lose what you already have. This is loss aversion. You protect for losing more space, losing any space, which makes everyone better off than the happiness you display when you're provisioned extra lanes. Loss hurts more than the pleasure of a gain. And the pleasure of a gain is short lived. I'll tell you why. Because there's also this thing called Jevons paradox. We'll talk about that some other time, or you can Google it. In the long term, an increase in provisioning extra lanes will generate an increase in consumption of that space by more motor vehicles rather than actually a decrease. It doesn't. It doesn't improve. It might improve in the short term, but in the long term, it's only going to induce more demand. It's called the law of induced demand. Right? So this was the fourth bias that I wanted to talk about. So now how do we get past these biases and not let them affect you? It's tough. Like Daniel Kahneman, who was known as the father of behavioral economics, once said, economics assumes people make rational choices, but by nature, people are irrational. He actually co-developed this theory with Amos Tversky and called it the prospect theory, and that's what led them to kind of expand this field called behavioral economics. I like Dan Ariely's description better of this irrationality. He calls people are predictably irrational. So there is the predictability gives probably the rationality in the irrational, and you're trying to again make sense. While we apply these behavioral biases to individual choices, it is also important to remember that there are something called social norms that we operate in as a collective. Think about it. In the city, let's say some one person breaks a rule, right? And he's not caught. He's probably going on the wrong side of the road. This emboldens some others to follow suit. And then over time, that becomes a norm, which then becomes hard to tackle. The police will come and say, oh no, but this is the new habit. How do we even pull it back? But you didn't stop it when they started it. Right? I will tackle about norms in a different episode, but you need to remember that the collective way of thinking is slightly different from the individual way of thinking, and the way you tackle that is completely different. We'll do that in a different episode, but there is a book called The Nudge Theory by Richard Taylor and Cass Sunstein. They actually studied the use of these biases to nudge people to making different choices. So while marketers and others want to use this to their advantage, the fact that humans make heuristic-led decisions 90% of the time, for an individual like you and me, the effort has to be to slip into slow thinking every once in a while and avoid being abused for our heuristic thinking. Once you update your priors, you build trust around your choices, you will slip into heuristic based thinking anyway, but that's okay because you may have had enough information by then to make better choices. The news cycle, remember, however, feeds and allows you for the availability heuristic that they feed you. Anyway, this episode lays the foundation for individual behavioral biases, fallacies, and heuristics. There are lots of cognitive biases that have been identified. I just went into 4 useful ones to give you an idea of how to apply a bias to something that you deal with on a daily basis. There are books and videos around these topics, and the authors mentioned in this episode, I'll keep calling out the names. You can just Google them and find some books that are useful, or even watch their videos and gain more knowledge about these biases. This is very important because we'll be switching into other things from the next episode. The next episode, we'll talk about some more definitional concepts around public infrastructure in our cities. This is going to be interesting. And then we go into collective action problems in further episodes to see, once you understand what is the nature of public infrastructure, then we see how then we solve for that. And is our understanding right? How do we solve? There are various ways in which we need to solve, right? So let us know what you think of behavioral biases. Which ones do you recognize? And are you aware of some other that you think you need to read upon? And I'll see you in the next episode. Bye bye.